In the shadows of a Germanic forest, Rome suffered a wound so deep it shook the very foundations of its empire. 3 legions, proud and disciplined, marched into the mists and never returned. Their sacred eagles lost, their honor shattered, their blood soaking the soil of Teutoburg. From the Palatine Hill to the distant Rhine, whispers of fear echoed. Could the eternal empire truly fall to barbarian cunning? This is the story of betrayal, vengeance, and the fire of Rome's rebirth. Stay with us as we journey into the chaos after Teutoburg, where Rome bled, heroes rose, and vengeance burned bright. If history's greatest betrayals and battles ignite your soul, make sure to like, subscribe, and follow this saga to its final clash. The year was 89. In the dense and shadowed forests of Germania, Rome's pride marched with iron discipline. 3 legions, 17th, 18th, and 19th, advanced under the command of Publius Quinctilius Varus, governor of the newly annexed provinces. Their eagles glimmered in the dim light, symbols of an empire that believed itself unconquerable. Behind them trailed auxiliaries, camp followers, wagons loaded with supplies, an army not preparing for war, but believing itself secure in the peace Rome had imposed. Yet Germania was no subdued province. The land stretched wild and untamed, its forests impenetrable, its marshes treacherous, its people bound not by cities or walls but by clan and oath. Among these tribes, a man once trusted by Rome plotted their downfall. His name was Arminius, a prince of the Cherusci, trained in Roman arms, granted Roman citizenship, knighted as an equestrian. He had fought in Roman service, dined at Roman tables, and spoken Latin like a son of the empire. But beneath this facade, his heart burned for the freedom of his people. Arminius whispered into Varus's ear of a revolt deep within Germania. He urged the governor to march swiftly, to crush rebellion before it spread. Confident in his ally, Varus obeyed, leading his legions into unfamiliar territory. The roads narrowed into muddy paths, the sky turned gray, and the rain began to fall. Storm winds howled through the treetops, and the endless forest closed around them like a trap. Then the storm broke, not of rain, but of steel. From the shadows, spears rained down. War cries in 100 dialects echoed through the mist. Tribesmen surged from every side, striking with fury born of vengeance. The disciplined lines of Rome shattered. Their shields could not form ranks upon such broken ground. Wagons overturned, horses panicked, men slipped in the mire as the Germanic tide swept over them. For 3 days the massacre raged. Legionaries fell by the thousands, their cries muffled by the unyielding forest. Cohorts tried to rally, but the trees strangled their formations, turning order into chaos. Varus, realizing the disaster, chose death over capture. Falling on his own sword, around him the imperial machine collapsed into ruin. The eagles, sacred standards of Rome, were torn from the dying hands of their protectors. For the Germanic tribes, this was more than victory. It was humiliation delivered to the empire itself. The once mighty legions, symbols of Roman power, were wiped from existence. Few survived to tell the tale. When news reached Rome, it struck like a thunderbolt. The eternal city, mistress of the Mediterranean, had suffered defeats before, but never like this. Entire legions erased, their banners desecrated, their commander dead by his own hand. Augustus, the emperor, who had brought peace and stability after decades of civil war, now faced the nightmare of annihilation at the empire's frontier. Ancient writers tell us that upon hearing the news, Augustus wandered his palace, striking his head against the walls in despair, crying out, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." It was not simply the loss of men. It was the shattering of Rome's illusion of invincibility. The Germanic frontier, thought pacified, had erupted with a fury that mocked imperial arrogance. The forests of Teutoburg became a graveyard of Roman pride. Bones lay unburied, scattered among broken shields and rusting swords. Years later, when Roman soldiers dared to return, they found skulls nailed to trees, pits filled with the remains of their comrades, and altars where captured Romans had been sacrificed to the gods of the tribes. It was more than defeat, it was desecration. And so, a shadow fell across Rome. From the Senate to the legions, From the common streets to the imperial palace, a single question lingered. Had the empire overreached? Was the dream of extending Roman order beyond the Rhine nothing but folly? Thus began the nightmare at the Rhine. From the ashes of Varus's disaster, Rome would face its deepest wound and prepare for a reckoning unlike any it had ever known. Amid the carnage of Teutoburg, where discipline broke and hope withered, not all succumbed to despair. Amid fire, rain, and blood, a fragment of Roman courage endured. Scattered cohorts fled into the forest, hunted like beasts by Arminius's warriors. Most were cut down, their screams lost in the storm. Yet one officer, almost unknown even within his own legion, refused to let the empire's flame die in that wilderness. His name was Lucius Nonius, a tribune with neither noble lineage nor glorious record. But in the crucible of disaster, obscurity gave way to valor. Lucius rallied the remnants, centuries broken, shields splintered, spirits shattered. He carved a path through ambush after ambush, wielding not only his sword but the iron of his voice. "Rome still breathes," he cried to the terrified men. "Follow me, or perish here in the mud." In defiance of every ambush, Lucius fought through the labyrinth of trees, leading thousands from certain death to the safety of the Rhine. For Rome, those survivors became more than mere remnants. They were proof that even in ruin, Roman discipline could endure. Their escape carried with it whispers of hope, the ember from which vengeance might one day be kindled. But one man's defiance in the forest was only the beginning. In the wake of Varus's destruction, Augustus looked to his bloodline for salvation. Among his kin was a youth whose destiny would soon burn across the Rhine frontier. Germanicus Julius Caesar, adopted grandson of Augustus, nephew to Tiberius, heir of Rome's martial legacy. Germanicus was everything the empire craved in its darkest hour. Charismatic, handsome, beloved by soldiers, he carried not only the name of Caesar, but also the fire of vengeance. To the legions along the Rhine, demoralized, bloodied, trembling at the thought of Germanic warbands, his arrival was like the rising of a new sun. He spoke to them not as a distant commander, but as a brother in arms. He dined at their fires, listened to their grievances, and walked among their ranks with the ease of a man born for leadership. To the disheartened soldiers, his words rekindled belief. "Rome has bled," he declared, "but Rome does not yield. The forests that swallowed our brothers shall be cut down by our swords. Their ghosts cry out for justice, and we shall answer." The men cheered, not because he promised ease, but because he promised vengeance. And vengeance was a language they understood. Germanicus wasted no time. He reorganized the shattered frontier, instilled discipline where fear had spread, and prepared his legions for war. He restored the battered fortresses along the Rhine, ensuring that Germania would no longer see Rome as weak. He gave the men purpose beyond survival, the reclamation of honor. Yet Germanicus was not only a warrior, he was a symbol. To the Senate, he embodied the hope that Rome could rise from humiliation. To the soldiers, he was a commander who bled alongside them. To the people, he was a living legend, whose very name stirred visions of conquest. Still, he was young, and the shadow of Varus lingered. Whispers in Rome questioned whether vengeance could ever erase such a stain. Augustus was old, nearing his final days, his reign darkened by this disaster. It would fall to the next generation to prove that the empire had not grown soft, that its might had not been broken in the Germanic wilds, and Germanicus would not march alone. Veterans of Teutoburg, scarred but unbowed, swore their loyalty to him. They carried memories of comrades butchered, of eagles torn away, of humiliation etched into their souls. They were no longer fighting merely for conquest. They were fighting for redemption. It was in their eyes that Germanicus saw the true spirit of Rome, a people who might stagger but never collapse, who might bleed but never bow. He promised them that their suffering would not be in vain, that every Roman slain in the forest would be avenged tenfold. Thus, two figures emerged from the ashes of Varus's ruin. One was Lucius Nonius, the nameless tribune who proved that even amid slaughter, courage could carve a path to survival. The other was Germanicus, Caesar's heir, whose flame of vengeance promised to turn defeat into rebirth. Together, their stories intertwined, the unknown who saved lives and the noble who would lead legions. They represented the two halves of Rome, the humble soldier whose grit preserved the army, and the noble general whose vision promised revival. Without one, the other could not rise. Without survivors, there would be no army for Germanicus to command. Without Germanicus, those survivors would remain only a fragment of Rome's shame. As winter closed upon the Rhine and the empire buried its dead, one truth became clear. Rome's nightmare had given birth to its champions. The stage was set for a new campaign, one not of conquest but of vengeance. For in the heart of Germanicus, the oath had already been sworn. Rome's honor would be restored. The Rhine would not be Rome's grave. It would be the river from which the empire would rise again. The forests of Teutoburg had swallowed 3 legions whole, but their destruction reached far beyond the Rhine. The shock wave reverberated across the empire, rattling marble pillars in Rome as fiercely as it had shaken wooden forts on the frontier. For a power that had conquered Carthage, crushed Greece, and tamed the East, the loss was not just military, it was existential. In the Senate, silence fell heavy when the disaster was announced. Seasoned senators, men who had survived the civil wars, trembled at the magnitude of the defeat. Some whispered that the gods themselves had turned against Rome. Others feared that the Germanic tribes, emboldened by their triumph, would surge across the Rhine and pour into Gaul, perhaps even into Italy itself. The illusion of Roman invulnerability had shattered. Augustus, the old emperor, bore the weight of this catastrophe like a crown of thorns. For decades he had boasted of Pax Romana, the Roman peace, an age in which civil wars ended and borders were secure. But now in the twilight of his reign, Germania had become a wound he could not heal. Ancient sources tell us he tore his clothes in grief, refusing to cut his hair or beard, muttering day and night, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." To his court, it was the cry of a man haunted by failure. To the people of Rome, it was the voice of despair. The Rhine frontier itself teetered on collapse. Survivors from Teutoburg staggered into their camps, eyes hollow, bearing tales of treachery and slaughter. Panic spread through the ranks. Many forts were abandoned in haste, soldiers retreating westward, fearing that at any moment Arminius's war bands would descend. Civilian settlers fled in droves, their farms and villas burned, their families seeking refuge behind the walls of Gaulish cities. Recruitment became desperate. The legions had lost not only men but prestige, and filling the ranks was no simple task. Augustus resorted to extraordinary measures, pressing freedmen, even criminals, into service, scouring the provinces for able-bodied men. Veterans too old for war were recalled, their weary hands forced once more to grip the gladius. The proud machine of Rome, once the envy of the world, now relied on reluctant conscripts and scattered remnants, and morale was poisoned by fear. Soldiers whispered of the forest as a cursed land, haunted by the shades of their slaughtered comrades. Some muttered that the Germanic gods had proven stronger than Jupiter, that Rome's legions could not conquer endless woods and bottomless swamps. Mutiny flared more than once along the Rhine, fueled by exhaustion, grief, and the sense that their commanders had led them into ruin. Nor was the empire united in its grief. Tiberius, the stepson of Augustus and a seasoned general in his own right, was dispatched to stabilize the frontier. He succeeded in restoring order, but his presence sparked quiet rivalries. Many saw Tiberius as cold and ruthless, respected more than loved. Meanwhile, Germanicus, youthful, charismatic, adored by soldiers, loomed as a potential rival. Even in disaster, ambition stirred. Rome's greatest weakness was not always its enemies abroad, but the divisions within its own halls of power. In the provinces, the disaster emboldened unrest. In Pannonia and Dalmatia, far from Germania, rebellious tribes rose in arms, sensing Rome's vulnerability. The legions, stretched thin, now faced crises on multiple fronts. The empire that had prided itself on order now felt the creeping chaos of overstretch. Every governor, every commander feared their own province might be the next to ignite. The common people, too, felt the tremor. Merchants along the Rhine watched their trade collapse. Farmers in Gaul feared raids. Roman citizens, once secure under the eagle's shadow, now whispered of barbarian invasion. Rumors spread faster than truth, of Germanic hordes already marching for Italy, of Rome's legions unable to stand against them. Fear gnawed at the empire like rot. And yet, even in despair, Rome endured. The Senate did not fall. The emperor did not abdicate. The Rhine legions, though broken, did not disband. The empire staggered, but it did not collapse. It was as though Rome herself, wounded but unbroken, clenched her teeth against the storm. Still, the questions could not be silenced. Could the frontier ever be secure again? Could the legions reclaim their honor? Could Rome, scarred by betrayal, rise from the ashes of Teutoburg? In the smoky halls of the camps, soldiers sharpened their blades in grim silence. In the palaces of Rome, senators debated vengeance or retreat, and in the heart of Augustus, the wound festered as his reign drew to its end. The empire was shaken to its core. Germania had not merely defeated 3 legions, it had forced Rome to confront its own mortality. But in turmoil, seeds of destiny were sown. From the cracks in the empire's armor would rise the fire of vengeance. For though Rome faltered, she had not yet spoken her last word. To understand Rome's nightmare, one must understand the man who conjured it. Arminius, prince of the Cherusci, was no wild barbarian hurling crude spears in blind fury. He was a soldier of Rome's own making, a warrior forged in the discipline of the legions, trained in their tactics, raised in their camps. As a youth, he had been sent to Rome as a hostage, as so many sons of tribal leaders were. There he learned the Latin tongue, absorbed Roman customs, and was granted the coveted rank of equestrian. He wore their armor, marched in their drills, and fought beside them against other tribes. To the empire he appeared the model of loyalty, but behind his eyes smoldered a deeper fire. Arminius never forgot the humiliation of seeing his people bound by treaties, their warriors forced to fight Rome's wars, their independence traded for peace that reeked of servitude. He learned from Rome, yes, but not to serve her. He learned to destroy her. By the year AD 9, he had become commander of Germanic auxiliaries in Varus's own army. He was trusted, praised, even embraced as an ally. Yet in secret, he wove together the threads of revolt. Clan by clan, chieftain by chieftain, he forged unity where before there had been only rivalry. The Cherusci, the Bructeri, the Marsi, the Chatti, all fierce, all proud, all suspicious of one another. But Arminius convinced them that their survival demanded unity. Rome could conquer each tribe alone. Together they could bring the empire to its knees. And so deception became his weapon. When whispers of unrest reached Varus, Arminius urged immediate action. "We must march," he counseled, "before the flames of revolt consume the province." Varus believed him, blind to the trap. For who could suspect treachery from the man who had dined at his table and commanded under his banner? The trap was perfect. Arminius led the legions into the forest, then vanished, leaving his allies to strike from the shadows. The slaughter that followed was not mere battle. It was the fulfillment of a vision. For Arminius, it was not enough to kill Romans. He sought to destroy their aura of invincibility, to tear away the mask of empire, and show his people that Rome could bleed. In the aftermath, Arminius became more than a chieftain. He became a symbol. To the tribes, he was no longer merely leader of the Cherusci, but liberator of Germania. Songs praised him, warriors swore by his name. Mothers told their sons that he had humbled the greatest empire on earth. Where once clans fought one another for pasture and pride, now they looked to Arminius as proof that unity could shatter Rome. Yet Arminius's power was not absolute. Unity among the tribes was fragile, built on shared hatred rather than lasting trust. Old feuds simmered beneath the surface. Some chieftains, wary of Rome's wrath, hesitated to commit fully to his cause. Others envied his fame, whispering that he sought not freedom for Germania, but kingship for himself. For a people who despised tyranny, such suspicion was poison. Still, Arminius pressed on. He fortified his alliances, exploited the land itself as his ally. The forests and swamps of Germania were his fortress, the rivers his roads, the mists his cloak. Unlike Rome, bound to roads and supply lines, Arminius's warriors moved with the forest, vanishing and striking at will. They fought not for plunder or territory, but for the survival of their way of life. Every fallen Roman was a step toward freedom. To Rome, he was both phantom and nightmare. Scouts whispered of his movements but seldom found him. Ambushes erupted without warning, cutting down patrols, burning outposts, terrorizing settlers. He did not seek pitched battles where Roman discipline might prevail. He sought attrition, exhaustion, terror. Rome could rebuild legions, but could it rebuild the confidence of its soldiers, the faith of its people, the aura of inevitability that had carried its conquest for centuries? Arminius wagered that it could not, but his challenge was not merely tactical, it was ideological. He offered his people a vision beyond clan feuds, a Germania free of Roman chains. For tribes long divided, this was intoxicating. For Rome, it was a threat as profound as Hannibal's march across the Alps or Spartacus's revolt in Italy. And so, across the Rhine, two destinies began to clash. On one side stood Rome, wounded but unbroken, preparing under Germanicus to avenge the legions. On the other stood Arminius, the traitor hero, armed with cunning, unity, and the wild strength of the forests. He was not merely an enemy general, he was the embodiment of everything Rome feared, a former ally who knew their ways, wielding his knowledge against them with devastating effect. As winter cloaked Germania, Arminius stood at the height of his power. Tribes rallied to his banner, victories emboldened his cause, and Rome hesitated, licking its wounds. Yet shadows gathered even among his allies, for the same passions that drove unity could just as easily drive betrayal. Still, for the moment, he was the master of the North. To his people, he was the liberator. To Rome, he was the face of terror. And the name whispered along the Rhine, in camps and in senate halls alike, was the same, Arminius. Out of ruin, Rome called forth a leader destined to turn despair into defiance. Germanicus Julius Caesar, adopted grandson of Augustus, nephew of Tiberius, stood as the empire's chosen torchbearer. Where Varus had brought disaster, Germanicus would bring resolve. Where Arminius had united tribes with cunning, Germanicus would rally legions with honor. He was young, but already his reputation shone. Soldiers adored him for his charisma and humanity. Unlike commanders who ruled with cold detachment, Germanicus shared in the burdens of his men. He walked the muddy roads beside them, endured the same storms, and spoke with fire that lit their weary hearts. To the battered legions of the Rhine, his presence was not that of a distant noble, but of a brother in arms. When Augustus died in AD 14, the empire trembled once more. Tiberius ascended to the throne, but unrest shook the legions. Mutinies broke out along the Rhine and in Pannonia. Soldiers furious over poor pay, endless campaigns, and the memory of Teutoburg's ghosts. They threatened to march on Rome itself. It was Germanicus who calmed the storm. He risked his life entering the camps, surrounded by armed men crying for revolt. Where another commander might have called for executions, he listened. Where another might have retreated, he stood firm. He promised reform, he invoked their loyalty to the empire, and he appealed to their pride as Romans. When words faltered, he led them into battle against neighboring tribes, channeling their rage into victory. Through this, discipline was restored. Through him, the frontier held. But Germanicus's heart burned for more than stability. He hungered for vengeance. The forests of Teutoburg still whispered with the bones of Rome's dead, and the sacred eagles remained in barbarian hands. He vowed not only to defend the Rhine, but to cross it, to carry the war back into Germania, to show the world that Rome's spirit had not perished in the swamp. He prepared as Rome had never prepared before. Along the Rhine, he assembled a massive force, 8 legions, supported by cavalry, auxiliaries, and allies. To supply them, he constructed a fleet of 1,000 ships, built for rivers and seas alike. With this armada, he could move troops deep into Germania, bypassing its treacherous forests and striking where least expected. It was a vision of boldness and precision, marrying Roman engineering with relentless determination. The campaign began with fire and steel. Germanicus led his forces into enemy territory, laying waste to villages that had celebrated Rome's defeat. He freed allied tribes who had suffered under Arminius's dominance, binding them once more to the empire. Each step was paid in blood, but each victory reignited the pride of the legions. Yet Germanicus was not content with mere retribution. He sought symbols, moments that would etch themselves into Roman memory, and none was greater than the march to Teutoburg itself. Years after the disaster, he led his men to the very ground where Varus and his legions had fallen. There, among the rotting weapons, the scattered bones, the pits of sacrifice, the Romans stood in silence. The earth itself seemed to weep with memory. Soldiers who had once whispered of curses now felt fury boil in their veins. Germanicus ordered funerary rites for the dead. With solemn dignity, the legions buried their fallen brothers at last, laying them to rest under Roman ritual. Some wept openly, others clenched fists in rage, but all felt the same vow ignite. This shame would not endure. Rome would reclaim its honor. From that sacred moment, his campaign transformed. Battles erupted across Germania, rivers stained red, forests echoing with the clash of steel. Germanicus fought not only with strategy, but with passion, his very presence lifting men to feats they thought impossible. Against the Cherusci, the Bructeri, the Chatti, he struck blow after blow. He captured one of the lost eagles of Varus's legions, a trophy that electrified Rome. News raced to the Senate. The dishonor of Teutoburg was being avenged. Statues of Germanicus rose. Songs spread his fame, and whispers grew that he might eclipse even Tiberius. But Germanicus's greatness was not only in conquest. He understood the theater of war, the power of symbols, the necessity of morale. Every march, every victory, every ceremony was woven into a story larger than the battles themselves. He was not simply defeating tribes. He was restoring the soul of Rome. Still, the war was not without peril. Arminius remained elusive, striking in ambush, retreating into forests, rallying tribes with fiery speeches of freedom. Germanicus faced not a kingdom, but a hydra of clans, bound by Arminius's vision, yet ever on the verge of fracturing. It was a war not merely of swords, but of wills. Roman discipline against Germanic ferocity, imperial vengeance against native defiance. Through it all, Germanicus endured. He drove his fleet down the Ems, clashed at the Weser, and pushed the frontier deeper than any Roman since Varus's fall. He did not conquer Germania, but he shattered the illusion that Rome was broken. The empire, wounded but unbowed, stood tall once more. In Germanicus, the legions saw the embodiment of renewal, a commander who turned grief into action, despair into resolve, defeat into the seat of victory. He was more than a general. He was Rome's answer to Arminius, the living proof that the empire could bleed and yet rise stronger. The stage was set. Germania would not bow easily, and Arminius remained defiant. But Rome no longer trembled. Under Germanicus, Rome prepared not to defend, but to strike. The fire of rebirth had been lit. The fire of vengeance burned brightest in the campaigns of AD 15 and 16. Germanicus, now at the height of his command, carried Rome's banners deeper into Germania than any legion dared since Teutoburg. No longer was Rome merely surviving along the Rhine. She was striking with fury, driven by the promise that the ghosts of Varus's legions would finally be avenged. The armies moved like thunder. 8 legions, tens of thousands of auxiliaries, and an immense cavalry arm, all bound to the will of Germanicus, advanced across rivers and forests. The fleet he had built carried them swiftly along the northern waterways, bypassing swamps and outflanking tribes who thought themselves safe in their wilderness. And always standing against him was Arminius. No longer a faceless, barbarian chieftain, Arminius had become Rome's nemesis. A commander every bit as cunning as Germanicus was brilliant. He rallied the Cherusci and their allies with fiery speeches, calling upon them to fight not only for survival, but for the very idea of freedom. His words painted Rome not as conqueror, but as eternal oppressor. And in his defiance, he gave the tribes something they had never known: unity. The two men became shadows to one another. Arminius, the wolf of the forest, Germanicus, the eagle of Rome. Their war was not a single battle, but a storm of ambushes, sieges, raids, and set-piece clashes. At the Battle of Viso in AD 16, their rivalry reached its peak. There, along the banks of the Weser River, Germanicus drew up his legions in full strength. The air trembled with the beating of drums, the blare of horns, the steady roar of disciplined men. Across the field, Arminius and his warriors surged from the forest with wild cries, their hair knotted, their shields painted with fierce designs, their courage unbroken. The clash was titanic. Roman discipline against Germanic fury, shield walls against screaming charges. Germanicus, riding at the front, urged his men onward with a fire that blazed through their fear. Arminius, at the head of his tribes, fought like a lion, cutting down Romans with his own hand, his body streaked with blood and mud. But the tide turned. The Roman legions, trained and relentless, began to push the tribes back step by step. Arminius was wounded, his warriors shattered, and the field became a slaughter. When the dust cleared, the ground was carpeted with the dead, the Weser running red with blood. Rome had triumphed. The victory sent shockwaves through the empire. In Rome, the Senate rejoiced, proclaiming Germanicus a second Scipio, a savior who had avenged the shame of Varus. Statues rose in his honor, poets sang of his glory, and whispers grew louder that he was destined not only to command armies, but to rule. Yet Germania was not conquered. For every tribe defeated, another rose. For every battlefield won, another forest remained. Arminius, though battered, escaped into the wilderness, rallying survivors, vowing never to yield. He became once more a ghost, an enemy who could never be destroyed outright. And here lay the paradox of Rome's resurrection. Germanicus had proven that the empire was not broken, that it could strike back with unmatched fury. He had restored honor, recovered lost eagles, and written vengeance into the soil of Germania. But conquest itself remained elusive. The land was too vast, the tribes too fierce, the forests too merciless. Tiberius, wary of Germanicus's rising fame and cautious of endless war, recalled him to Rome. The legions, though victorious, were denied the final triumph they craved, the total subjugation of Germania. And so the story closed not with Rome planting its standards over a conquered land, but with something greater, the rebirth of Rome's spirit. The Teutoburg disaster had once seemed the death knell of Roman power. 3 legions annihilated, an empire humiliated, enemies emboldened. But through Germanicus, Rome had risen from the ashes. She had shown the world that she could bleed and yet strike back, that her legions could fall and yet march again with pride. The Rhine remained Rome's frontier, but it was no longer a symbol of fear. It was a line of strength, defended by men who had looked into the abyss of defeat and refused to vanish. Germania remained unconquered, but Rome endured unconquerable. Arminius, in time, was betrayed and murdered by his own kin. Germanicus, recalled to the east, would die young, poisoned under mysterious circumstances. Neither lived to see the ultimate destiny of their struggle, but their duel, wolf and eagle, forest and empire, became legend. For Rome, the resurrection lay not in new provinces, but in renewed defiance. From Teutoburg's ashes to Viso's triumph, the message was carved in steel and blood. Rome could be wounded, but Rome would never be broken. The nightmare had become a story of rebirth, and the empire, chastened yet unyielding, stood ready to face the centuries still to come.